All participants have been unmuted.
Okay, hello. Can people hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, I just want to thank you for allowing me to come back and visit with all of you. I was so impressed and inspired with the award winners at the event that I was at in December, and really excited to connect with a lot of you now and share the ideas that we talked about then that we've been building for the last 20 years at Public Allies. Just to start, I want to say that when we talk about the idea of everyone leads, we don't mean everyone should be in charge at the same time, or there's no need for hierarchy, or that everything should be flat. What it does mean is that leadership's a muscle everybody has, and that the goal of any social change effort should be to build the collective leadership muscle of our organizations and communities. But that it starts at the foundation of the idea that it's a muscle everyone has, and it only gets stronger with exercise and practice. And the more we create opportunities for people to exercise and practice leadership, the greater the solutions will be. I'd like to begin today with just some stories that kind of start to lay the groundwork for how we kind of look at this. And the first is a woman named Biz Talbot Scott. Biz was an 18-year-old single mother who was in community college. She was receiving public assistance. She describes herself, that person, as knowing she was smart but having no idea of her potential. And this mother, who had a 3-year-old son at the time, enrolled in our program. And we thought she had great potential. But after completing her year of service in her community in our leadership program, she went on to university in Milwaukee, Marquette University, University of Michigan Law School, began a prestigious legal career in Washington, and most recently was one of the directors of presidential personnel at the White House. And most people don't look at a single mother, teen mother in community college and think there's a White House lawyer. Peter Hoffa's a different kind of story. Peter was 27 years old. He had a philosophy degree in college, which meant that he was working at a deli. And Peter was working at the deli one day when a woman came in and asked if she could hang a Public Allies poster in the deli. And he struck up a conversation with her, and he describes himself at that point of his life as someone who stayed up late at night talking about politics and social issues with his friends, but never thinking he could actually do something about it. And Peter ended up working at Legal Action of Wisconsin, where he began working with people with disabilities and found he had a passion for that population. Today, he's CEO of NAMI of Greater Milwaukee, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, and one of our state's top disability rights advocates. And the reason why I like to share those stories is because they're different kinds of stories, but they illustrate to me the leadership potential that is in our communities that goes untapped. There's incredible leadership out there that we're not accessing and building, and that we need to solve problems in our community. The reason why I'm so passionate about this is that photo's me when I was 18, 19 actually, and I was someone who grew up struggling with depression and addiction. I was institutionalized. I was homeless when I was 18 after high school, and was someone that would have never been thought of as a leader or thought of myself as a leader or really thought I could do much. And it was through social services I received, as well as mentors who came into my life, that my life turned around and it began to get on track, and went back to college at my local university. And it was natural, I think, when so many people had helped me, I wanted to figure out how I could help others and didn't know how or what I could do. It was in December of 1992 that my university posted a conference that students could go to as observers. And I went to this conference and sat down next to this woman the first night who told me she was starting a nonprofit called Public Allies to find young people who wanted to make a difference and help them turn that passion into a career working for social change. And I said, that's exactly what I want to do. And she looked at me and said, why don't you do it in Milwaukee? And with all the experience I had as a gardener, a telemarketer, an insurance agency, and a former drug dealer, I thought I could start a nonprofit organization. And I wouldn't have imagined that 20 years later I would be an advisor to the President of the United States, or leading a network now of almost 6,000 leaders in 23 communities across the country. But it's my own story, and I have that jagged line there because there's been a lot of ups and downs along the way. But it really reinforces my belief in what's possible, because no one looking at me back then or knowing me back then would have considered what I'm doing now an option. And I have seen so many other stories like mine within our network of young people we've developed, that it's just given me incredible belief in what's possible and in the incredible talent and leadership that is in our communities ready if we engage them. The way we look at leadership in public guys is based on 3 ideas. The first is that leadership's an action everyone can do, not just a position few people can hold. When we shift our thinking from the noun to the verb, we really open up the possibilities of who can participate and what it means. The second part of the definition is really the core work of leadership. What do leaders do? Leaders step up and take responsibility. They say, I'm going to do what it takes, learn what I have to learn, work with whoever I have to work with, get this done. They own a result. They own a solution. That's the responsibility of leadership, and that really is what leadership is. Leaders step up and take responsibility. And the third part of the definition is about values, and that's where I'm going to spend most of my time today. But we would argue that values are really the secret sauce of leadership, that great leadership is defined not by someone's skills or knowledge, but really by the values they express through their leadership. If you think about the worst boss you ever had, or the biggest pain in the butt on your board, or someone in a group you're on a team that doesn't work well, it's usually not about how much knowledge or skills they have. It's usually that it's about the values. It's about how well they listen, how well they work with others, how much they practice what they preach and do what they're going to say, do what they say they'll do. It's all about the values. And yet when we talk about leadership, we don't often hear about that. I want to walk through the first 2 parts of this, and then we're going to spend more time on the third. But to kind of illustrate this point of leadership as an action, not a position, we often learn stories about heroes in our cultures. And those are great stories. But typically, if we dig into any heroic leadership journey, we always find out it's more complicated. And I would argue that we find out that the leadership story is much different. And so I want to take a moment from American history, an important moment in American history a lot of people know about, which is the Montgomery Bus Boycott in 1955, when Rosa Parks refused to move to the back of the bus and was arrested and helped spark the modern civil rights movement in the 1950s, 60s. And I want to start by just kind of telling the story, maybe for those, I'm hoping everyone knows the basics of the story, but I want to tell the story in a way you might not have heard it before. And I want to start with Mrs. Parks. Rosa Parks was a rebel her whole life. She first stood up for herself on segregation as a preschool, as a kindergartner, I believe. She, throughout her whole life, had been a radical. And she fell in love with her husband, Raymond, when he became involved in the Scottsboro 9 case, which was a case in Alabama in which 9 young men had been falsely accused of rape. And the Communist Party of America financed the defense, and Raymond became an organizer in that effort. And she claims that she married him because he was the first man who was as radical as she was. In 1942, she and Edie Nixon ran to lead the local chapter of the NAACP. Edie Nixon was a member of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, which were the butlers on trains. And he became president and she secretary. They were the first working class people to have leadership roles in an NAACP. And they held those roles for over a decade, including a term as state chair, state president, and state secretary. Through her work with the NAACP, she went to trainings in Florida and Tennessee by the great organizer Ella Baker. And Ella became a mentor of hers and began corresponding with her and supporting her in her work. And one of the things she encouraged her to do was that Rosa Parks created a NAACP Youth Council in Montgomery that she led, in which she worked with young people in the community to help them stand up to segregation in Montgomery. Through her work as a seamstress one day, she got to work for Clifford and Virginia Dewar making dresses for their daughters. And they were the town's leading white liberals. And Virginia Dewar was talking to her about her work at the NAACP. and suggested that Rosa should go to the Highlander Folk School, which was a school in Tennessee that provided 2-week-long training in nonviolent civil disobedience to racially integrated groups. And Virginia Dewar raised money among her friends to sponsor Rosa to go to the Highlander School for training in nonviolent civil disobedience. There she was trained by the great organizers, Seema Clark and Miles Horton, who saw her as a real leader in the South and began corresponding with her and working with her to help develop her as a civil rights leader. A young lawyer moved to Montgomery named Fred Gray. He was 24 years old, and Rosa Parks began meeting with him every week for lunch and worked to engage him in doing civil rights law in Montgomery and working for the NAACP. In February of 1955, a 15-year-old girl, Claudette Colvin, refused to move to the back of the bus in Montgomery and was arrested. She was a member of Rosa Parks' Youth Council. A number of leaders led by Rosa believed that they should use her case to challenge segregation in Montgomery. But a lot of the male leaders in town felt that she wasn't a sympathetic enough person. She was a teen. She had allegedly resisted arrest. There was rumors she was pregnant. And so in the end, the NAACP decided not to pursue Claudette Colvin's case as the case to overturn segregation. A few months later, Rosa Parks refuses to move to the back of the bus and is arrested. Now, the New York Times obituary of her when she died referred to her as an accidental activist. The White House on the 100th anniversary of her birth said that she inadvertently started a movement. How accidental does she sound at this point? Rosa Parks gets arrested. Edie Nixon and Clifford and Virginia Dewar go to get her out of jail, go back to her home and talk for several hours with her and her husband about using her case to challenge segregation in Montgomery. She and her husband are clear they will lose everything, and they did, if they take this on, but they make the courageous choice to use her case and to be the symbol to take on segregation in the South. The first call Edie Nixon makes is to Fred Gray, asking him to represent his friend Rosa. The next call he makes is Johanna Robinson, who's head of the Women's Political Council in Montgomery. Johanna Robinson and the Women's Political Council, which is a group of black women, have been calling for a couple of years for a bus boycott. And he tells her, go. Johanna Robinson goes to her employer, which is Alabama State College, a state university for African-American students. And she goes and makes 15,000 flyers overnight. Imagine making 15,000 flyers on 1955 technology. Imagine doing it on 2014 technology overnight. And she did that on state-owned equipment in a state that sanctioned segregation. And she got the flyers out to the council and distributed to women the next day all over Montgomery. The next calls Edie Nixon made was to Ralph Abernathy, who was the pastor of First Baptist Church, and he asked Ralph if he could get all the pastors together Friday afternoon. The arrest had happened on a Thursday, so that they could talk to him about this movement and they could call for a bus boycott from the pulpits on Sunday. Ralph Abernathy said, well, you know, there's this new pastor in town and no one really knows him, and if he gets run out of town, no one will notice, so let's do it at his church. And that's how Martin Luther King got drafted into the movement at age 24. And Dexter Avenue Baptist Church hosted the first meeting of the pastors. Only one white pastor attended, who happened to be Rosa Parks' pastor, Robert Grace, and his home was bombed in retaliation for his attendance. They decided as they began walking, as they began boycotting the buses, that they needed to create an organization to support the effort. And they called the Montgomery Improvement Association. And they, sorry, I'm getting used to webinar space. But in creating the Montgomery Improvement Association, they needed a leader. And Edie Nixon was going to run to lead that, as he had the local NAACP. But his biggest rival running the NAACP was a man named Rufus Lewis, who was a local business owner. And it incensed him that a working class, as he called, unlearned man kept beating him for leadership, and he didn't want Edie Nixon to run the MIA. So Rufus Lewis had an idea. He was going to run his young pastor as a candidate with the belief that he could kind of control him and kind of lead from behind. And so he nominated his young pastor, Martin Luther King, to lead the Montgomery Improvement Association. And that's how King became head of the Montgomery Improvement Association. The first thing King did was call his dad, who connected him to a pastor in Louisiana who'd led a successful bus boycott. This wasn't the first. And the first thing that he told him is that people will march only for a few days, and then you've got to figure out how to get everyone to school, to work, to shopping, to groceries, to church, to everywhere for as long as it takes. And so they realized they have to create a carpool system. So Martin Luther King thanked Rufus Lewis for the nomination by appointing him transportation chair. But Lewis organizes a 350-car carpool that transports everyone to school, work, church, shopping for 12 months. To raise money for all the gas for all these people and the tickets because they got pulled over constantly by the police, two women, Georgia Gilmore and Inez Ricks, created cooking clubs that cooked food all week, sold it on Sundays to raise money to support the gas and ticket costs associated with that. To also raise money, Ella Baker took Rosa Parks on a tour of the North to raise money from NAACP donors. Miles Horton and the Doers raised money from the Highlander Donor Network to support the Montgomery Improvement Association. And then Bayard Rustin came to town. Edie Nixon was a member of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, and their national leader, A. Philip Randolph, was really the dean of the civil rights movement for most of the early 20th century. And A. Philip Randolph's key organizer was Bayard Rustin, and so he sent Rustin down to Montgomery. And the first thing Rustin did was he went to go see this preacher he had heard about, Martin Luther King, and he goes to King's home, and King had a man stationed outside his front door with a gun. He had a man sitting on the roof with a gun. And I'll just ask if people can mute who are in listen mode, it would help because we're getting some background noise. I think it's *6 is the mute if you don't have a mute button on your phone. And Bayard Rustin came into Dr. King's house, and Dr. King was also carrying a sidearm. He had applied to the governor of Alabama, in fact, for a concealed carry permit to carry a gun with him at all times. And Rustin talked to him about the idea of using this movement to test a Gandhian nonviolent method, because Rustin was a Gandhian pacifist. And first thing he suggested to King was to get rid of all the guns. And the second thing he suggested to him was that they should take over 100 members of the Montgomery Improvement Association had been indicted, and that they should all put on their Sunday best and march down to the courthouse and turn themselves in. It was the first real Gandhian effort of the movement. But Bayard Rustin was a true outside activist. He had been a pacifist in World War II who was jailed for refusing to fight. He had been a member of the Communist Party, and he was an openly gay black man in 1955. So he moved down to Birmingham into a hotel where he counseled King for the next 12 months and mentored him through the entire experience, and also became one of his closest advisors throughout the rest of his leadership, and was the man, in fact, who organized the March on Washington. But Rosa Parks' husband had been employed by the Communist Party. She had been an officer in the NAACP for over a decade. And so the leaders also felt she might not be a sympathetic case to overturn segregation because of her activism. So another woman who'd refused to move to the back of the bus and been arrested, Aurelia Browder, they used her case to challenge the segregation of Montgomery, and Fred Gray argued that case with the NAACP, and it went up to the Supreme Court, and it was that case that eventually overturned segregation in the South. So the question is, who was the leader of the Montgomery Bus Boycott? And that's the point I'm trying to make. Change always comes from the leadership of the many. It's never about the one leader. If it had just been Dr. King and Rosa Parks, none of it would have happened. And that doesn't diminish the immense courage of Rosa Parks or the incredible vision and leadership of Dr. King. What it recognizes is that their leadership was essential, but they weren't alone. They weren't the only leaders who were participating. And that's really how change often happens, is it's not about the individual. It's about lots of leaders stepping up together. One of my colleagues gave me a quote I like to read at this point because I think it really illustrates and I think lays out this idea, because we do get stuck on who is a leader and think that leaders come in fully formed or important or whatever. And he says, When we elevate leaders of particular movements to the mythic status of great man or woman, we do a disservice to everyone. By placing people on a historical pedestal, we forget that they grew, learned, made mistakes, and struggled throughout the tenure of their leadership. And we forget that these leaders were mentored, collaborated with other leaders, and had to get their followers to believe in their own capacity to step up and lead. Hero worship relegates the work, thought, and effort of ordinary people to something akin to pleasant background music. Local agents for change and progress lose their voice and are mercilessly converted into mindless, thoughtless followers of the great man or woman who leads them. In this frequently zero-sum game, all parties are diminished. In order for us to understand and build on this history, we must honor the true leadership paradigm, where leaders at all levels, those few who get recognized, and the countless others who contribute silently, are necessary for change. So whatever the changes we're trying to create, we should be thinking about what's our leadership strategy. How are we building the collective leadership muscle of our organization? How are we building that muscle within our community? How are we allowing as many people as possible to step up and lead? The second part of the definition is about taking responsibility, and just simply, we look at this in three ways. The first is that first responsibility, which is we are the ones we're waiting for. It's when you step up and say, I'm going to own this result. I'm going to make sure this happens. And that's really the first thing a leader does, is step up and own a result. The second part of our responsibility as leaders is to develop other leaders, because it's not just about us. All of us can point someone in our lives who saw something in us we didn't know we had, believed in us when we didn't believe in ourselves, gave us an opportunity to open a door for us that we weren't ready for. And when we think about who did that for us, we should be thinking also about how do we do that for others? How are we enabling other people to lead? If it takes the leadership of the many, then our first responsibility as a leader is enabling other people to lead as well. And the third part of that definition is about how we lead, that the ends don't justify the means. That if we want to lead long term, how we lead is as important as what we're leading for. And the way that we lead will define how people connect to and embrace our leadership and follow our leadership. I want to turn to the third part of the definition about the values. And the construct we like to use to talk about this comes actually from the U.S. Army. The leadership manual is called Be, Know, Do. And the basic idea is, first I have to understand, who am I as a leader? What's my mission? What's my group's mission? What are my values? What are my strengths and weaknesses? How do I work with others? And I have to master that before I master the knowledge and skills to achieve that mission. What I would argue is most leadership programs on campuses and communities focus on knowledge and skills, but in reality, it's the values that drive successful leadership. And it's that foundation that makes someone that people can really work with and follow and create change effectively. Yet we don't often talk about those values. In the last 20 years at Public Allies, we've identified 5 that we think are especially important for leaders today. And I'm going to walk through each of these. Excuse me, I will own that is my dog, who's being terrorized by a cat outside the window right now. So the first of the 5 values is about community assets. And Steve Ramos was a young man who had dropped out of high school. He went back to get what he called his good enough degree, or GED, and was thinking of becoming a cop in the Washington Heights neighborhood of New York where he grew up, when he got a chance to work in an after-school program there. And one day while working with the young people, he found out that a church that was near the youth center was closing a food pantry that had served the neighborhood for years because they didn't have enough volunteers and donations. And Steve had an idea: what if the kids from the youth center took over the food pantry? And so he did that. And the young people began collecting and distributing food. And I believe in the first 2 years, something like 60 tons or so of food was collected and distributed by these kids, thousands of meals. And these kids were mostly poor kids from Washington Heights themselves. And what happened, though, is that as this started to happen, more young people wanted to be in Steve's programs. And the young people in his program started doing better in school and having greater self-esteem. And what Steve kind of tapped into was that these young people are often thought of as the objects of service, as people to be served. And what Steve realized is what really would change their lives is if they became the subjects of service, if they became the servers themselves. They became the assets in their neighborhoods. And what Steve understood was the proverbial glass. And the age-old question, is it half empty or half full? And what we've determined at Public Allies after 20 years is that the correct answer to that question is yes, that the glass is both half empty and half full. And that every single one of us is like that glass. Every single one of us has gifts and talents that make us great family members, great friends, great workers, great leaders. It's the things that bring us to a community like Health Nexus and bring us to the work that we do in public health or whatever other issues we're working on. It's those assets we have. But each of us also have emptiness. We have relationships that have gone wrong. We have mistakes we've made. We have regrets that we hold. We have things that we're terrible at doing. We have all sorts of challenges in our lives. And that's not unusual. Everyone has that. But service is often about people who've defined themselves based on their fullness, going into communities that have been defined only by their emptiness, to help people who've also only been defined by their emptiness with the notion that their job is to fill them up. We think that at best that's arrogant and at worst it's oppressive. We think that a leader has to be able to really recognize that fullness, that leaders find the fullness. It doesn't mean we deny, ignore, or automatically forgive the emptiness. It's there. But it's a question of where do you build a relationship from? And how do we have confidence in what we bring in terms of our assets and humility about what we don't bring and humility about our own lives so that we can connect to people in a way that's more transformative. That's not, I'm full, you're empty, I'm here to help you. But I've got some assets, you've got some assets, let's try and link them together and do something. And I understand you've got problems, I've got problems too. And it's recognizing that it's about building a more transformative relationship. And if you work in that way, if you lead in this way, and if you're able to find the fullness, it allows you to be able to start doing work more with communities rather than doing work to communities or for communities. The second value is diversity and inclusion. Monty Allen has a form of Tourette syndrome, I think it's called Capridolica or something like that, in which he involuntarily will start yelling and swearing at people. And as you might imagine, growing up with that was horrible. People thought he was crazy. He was told from a young age that he was mocked and teased. He was told from a young age he'd never be able to work in a real professional environment and that he should learn a trade. And he was sent to a technical high school. And it was a shop teacher in high school who realized that Monty was really smart. And that shop teacher had him start preparing for college and said, you should go to college. No one in Monty's family had ever been to college. And he found him a police officer with Tourette's who became a mentor of Monty's. And they started working together. And Monty went through and he graduated high school. He got into college at the University of Cincinnati and things started to go well. But then they turned. People teased and mocked him. He got thrown out of classes. He had filed a grievance against the university. And one day he decided that was it. It wasn't going to work for him. And he was sitting on a park bench on the campus and was crying when a faculty member saw him, and the professor sat down next to him and asked what was going on. And he told her his story, and she took him to go meet her dean. And the dean met with him and said, Monty, you're going to graduate from our university. And he met with the faculty. He told the faculty about Monty's condition and said, this is what's going to happen if he's in your classroom, and you have to prepare the other students and yourself for it happening. And if that will bother you, then, and you don't want him in your class, I'll personally work with him on those credits. And Monty went through and he graduated college, but even with his college degree, finding a job became hard because people didn't want him to work with people. And Monty ended up working as a night watchman and only could work really in jobs that had very little contact with people. And then he applied to do Public Allies, and it was hard to find an organization for him to work with in Cincinnati. And we contacted a group called the Free Store Food Bank, which had placed a lot of our young people before. And the supervisor there, Bob Littman, heard the story and said, send him over. This could be very interesting. And they interviewed him, and according to Bob, he both went racial and sexual in the interview. And he and their head of HR decided they'd have to throw out the HR manual to hire him, but they decided they wanted to. And they started him working in the back with food, and as he got more comfortable with the environment, they had him start working with clients. But the deal was he had to say to the clients, he had to explain his condition and tell the clients that he may start yelling at them or swearing at them in the course of working with them, and that he wouldn't be offended if they wanted to work with someone else. And what do you think happened? More people wanted to work with Monty. And not only that, but they found out in the course of his working with people that because he had survived on disability for years, he really understood the system, and that he really had expertise in how to help people navigate the disability system. And really what if you go back to the point of assets, what he basically said to people was, hi, I'm empty, you're empty too, but I have some fullness I'm going to share with you. And he changed the power dynamic of service in the opening of telling them about his condition. And that's why people wanted to work with him. People coming to a place like that are feeling very empty, and they're feeling judged. And the moment he removes that barrier, it changed things. But not only that, but according to Bob, it changed the way they all worked there. That having Monty on their staff meant they all had to work differently. They had to think differently. They started recognizing how people with other forms of disabilities that there were barriers for at their agency. They started realizing other forms of diversity that they had to pay attention to. And I think that the most important aspect of this story in terms of what Bob Littman, the supervisor, shared was they understood that when you change, that diversity inclusion means that when you change who's at the table, you have to be willing for the table itself to change. That having someone with a disability like that on staff meant they had to think differently about all sorts of things. And they had to be willing to change their environment, change their work, and change the way they did things to accommodate him. But in doing so, he would argue they got better at serving all the people that they work with. And diversity and inclusion is both about, it's really a results-oriented effort. It's not about your intention, but it's asking the question, who's at our table? Do we have all the voices and perspectives that we need from our community at our table? And if we don't, how are we proactively and affirmatively and assertively going after building those relationships and building those connections? And all of our communities are different, and what connotes diversity in your community might be different than what it is in mine. However, the question is, who's not at our table? What voices and perspectives do we need that we don't have? And then do we understand that when we bring those different perspectives in, we have to be willing to change the table itself, our process, our power structure, that we have to be open to change itself. The other thing important within this is that we have to constantly check ourselves on the distorting lens of privilege and how our assumptions about how things work for people might not actually be how they work. I was working with some schools a few years ago, and they were complaining about why parents don't show up more at the activities, and this was a low-income school. And I asked them how many things they get involved with in the neighborhood themselves. And I asked about the time, because they schedule the conferences during the workday, so they only do 1 2-hour period at night, but most of them are done between 3:30 and 5:30 p.m. And people who are working class have to take off work, hourly work often, to do that, at which point they're not getting paid. and just how people sometimes make decisions when setting up services that don't factor in how people actually live their lives, and often because they don't have people, again, around their table who bring perspectives that are different or challenge the perspective, and that those of us working in this field can get distorted by our own privileges and thinking about how to include people and bring them to the table. The third value is about collaboration. Kalila Slater Harrington worked for several years for the Strive Project in Cincinnati, the Strive Collaborative, which was a network that really popularized this idea of collective impact. What collective impact basically means is that it moves the unit of analysis from organization to community. So in Milwaukee several years ago, there was a headline one day that we had the worst fourth grade reading scores for African American kids in the country. That same day I got an email from one of the largest youth organizations in the city claiming all the outcomes they were achieving with the 15,000 kids they serve. And what I couldn't understand is if they were achieving all these outcomes with 15,000 children, how could we still have the same bad data we'd had for 20 years? And what collective impact, and then a few months later, there was a headline in our local paper that our teen pregnancy rate, which had been the first or second highest in the country for over a decade, had started a precipitous decline. And they attributed it to the fact that the United Way and the city health department had begun an initiative where they brought all the programs together to work collectively on reducing the rate and aligning all their programs and strategies not to achieve their individual organizational outcomes, but to achieve a community-wide metric. So that really is the difference behind collective impact, is it's not about, is my organization achieving outcomes with the people I'm serving? It's, are we moving the needle for the whole community? And it doesn't matter what my outcomes are if the city-wide needle isn't moving. In Cincinnati, the Strive Network really popularized this idea, this concept in the last few years. And Kalila Slater Harrington was an alum of ours who ran their student success networks, which were the networks, the 14 networks of organizations that worked collaboratively on producing the citywide outcomes. And what Kalila shared with me was something that's best summed up by Peter Drucker, which is culture eats strategy for breakfast. That those collaborative teams that spent the time building relationships and trust outperformed those that just came together to do the work. And the reality is that collaboration is actually about conflict. Some people think if you're collaborating well, there's not conflict. We would argue that if you're collaborating well, there actually is conflict. The actual question is the conflict happening in the room or outside the room? If it's happening in the room, it's typically because there's trust, and people feel free to disagree and challenge each other's ideas, and that's a positive thing. That we consider constructive conflict. That's where you get innovation from. The other kind of conflict is when you leave the room and bitch about the people in the room, or you complain to someone about what someone did or said or what another group is doing, and you're having that conflict not directly, but in a way where you're complaining about others. That's destructive conflict. And so collaboration really is about how do you build the trust so that you can have the constructive conflict necessary to create more innovation and better solutions and work together, and to really hash out differences in an open, honest way, versus a false collaboration where everyone pretends everything's okay in the room and then they leave the room and they all feel awful about what happened in the room. And so in a way that if you're having real differences in the room, you know you've built the trust. If you don't have that, you haven't. And so collaboration is really about how do you build trusting relationships. The fourth value is about continuous learning. And about 9 years ago, the Echoing Green Foundation asked me to speak to their fellows and who are young people around the world starting new nonprofits. And they asked me to present to them how we built public allies. And I began writing that speech and then realized that it really would be useless to them. And I created instead a presentation called The Worst Practices of Social Entrepreneurship, where I laid out the 10 biggest mistakes that public allies had made in our first decade. the 10 do-overs I wish I could have. And the first slide of this was called Things I Suck At. And the reason was because the first do-over was not really understanding what I was good at and what I wasn't good at early on. And trying to do everything and not realizing that I needed to hire and trust people who could do what I couldn't do. And also just screwing up a lot of things because by trying to do things I just am not suited to do. And so, but before sharing this list of all the things that my organization had screwed up publicly, I decided to share it with our staff. But it was kind of scary to put up this list of things I suck at in front of my employees, and it included things like interpersonal conflict, personnel management, patience with process, administrative paperwork, being punctual, small talk, active listening, trusting my instincts, delegating responsibility, making unpopular decisions, fundraising, etc. Right? I suck at a lot of things. But putting this in front of my employees was kind of scary, and then something happened. Everyone started nodding. And the reason is because the things you suck at aren't a secret. If you are always late to every meeting, everyone notices. If you dominate discussions and talk too much, everyone notices. If you are the person who's always being negative and shooting down every idea, everyone notices. And the crazy thing is that what I've come to realize is that we all think we're fooling everybody. We give our allies 360 reviews twice during the year where they get reviewed on how they're practicing these values by their peers and their supervisors. And one of the things that really comes across when you talk to them after the fact is everyone's scared to get the results, but no one's ever really surprised by them. And I've come to the conclusion that that what we're always hoping is that no one notices, that we're fooling everybody, that the excuse we've given at every meeting we've been late at for the last 5 times has worked, and people don't think we're just always late. But guess what? They know we're always late. And so I think as a leader, you have 2 choices. You can own it, which creates the opportunity possibly people talk about it with you in terms of giving you feedback or holding you accountable or saying, listen, I'll handle this, you're not good at it or whatever. But it creates that possibility. Or we don't own it and they talk about it without us. And that's, again, when people leave the room and complain about the person in the room. And why do we do that? Because we can't give that person the feedback directly. So I think as a leader, if you are able to own the things you don't do well, your things I suck at list, again, it doesn't give you license to just continue sucking at it or not doing well or give you constant forgiveness. What it does mean is that you have the possibility and opportunity that you have to get better, but it allows people to hold you accountable and to talk about it with you. And beyond that, we as leaders constantly have to be in a learning mode to lead effectively. The 5th and final value is integrity, and this is simply, we look at this as how do you be true to that B? How do we be true to ourselves, our stories, our purpose, and our values? And how do we hold ourselves accountable to both those we work with and those we serve? And in terms of that B, we look at that as if every leader can articulate to the people they work with why I do the work I do, what is my mission? What is it that I care about? What is it I'm trying to do in this world? Why do I do this work? What are the milestones or moments in my life or inspirations that led me to do this? And how? What are the values I'm going to hold myself accountable to in doing this? If a leader can articulate that to the people they work with, they gain tremendously more influence and power than those who can't articulate those things. And I think it's really imperative for a leader for integrity to be able to really define, why do I do this work? What is the work I'm doing? And how will I do this work and be accountable to? I want to just close with a quote that I like to use to sum this up. Michelle Obama, who's the first lady here, as I think everyone knows, is a former employee of Public Allies and used to lead our Chicago office. And I worked with Michelle for many years, and she was one of the smartest people I ever worked with. But I never thought she'd be a fashion icon. When I worked with her, as you see in the photo, she always was in sweats and jeans. But she's one of the greatest leaders I've worked with. But Michelle, when she became First Lady, gave a speech about her time with my organization, Public Allies. I'd like to close because I think it sums up what I've talked about. And so this is a quote from Michelle. She said, "We all have skills and talents that make us good friends, family members, workers, and leaders. And we also have needs and shortcomings that come along with those strengths. We can't do well serving communities if we believe that we, the givers, are the only ones that are full and that everyone we're serving is empty. That's been the theme of my work in community my entire life, that there are assets and gifts out there in communities. And our job as good servants and good leaders is not only being humble, but it's having the ability to recognize those gifts in others and help them put those gifts into action. At Public Hours, we endeavored to do this by bringing these young people together from diverse backgrounds. We work with African Americans, Asian Americans, Latinos, Native Americans, white, gay, straight, you name it, college graduates, ex-felons. We brought them all together to work in a group, and truly that's where the magic happened. When you saw those kids from different backgrounds really tussling it out and trying to figure out their philosophies in the world and relationships to their beliefs and stereotypes. The law school graduates realized they had a lot to learn about how communities really work and how to engage people. There's nothing funnier than to watch a kid who believes they know it all actually come across some real tough problems in communities that test every fiber of what they believe. And then you see a young person with a GED realize that they could go to college because they're working with kids who are just as smart or not as smart as them who are going. And they gain a sense of the possibilities they have. They know their ideas are just as good, sometimes even better. That's when those lights go off. That's what we think of when we think of being asset-based, that a kid from Harvard and a kid with a GED are both full of promise. Everyone learned to build authentic relationships with one another where they could recognize each other's strengths and provide honest feedback on their challenges. They gained a blend of confidence and humility that prepared them to be able to lead from the streets to the executive suite. You could take any one of them and you could plop them down in any community, and they'd know how to build relationships. So I just want to close by saying that's really what we look at leadership as, is how do you really build relationships in a community where you can influence people and influence change and activate as much leadership as possible to create change. So let me close there and see if people have questions. I'm looking in the chat box, and I'll turn it back over to the moderators.
So thank you so much, Paul, for those inspiring words and your emphasis on concepts that I don't think we hear anywhere near enough about, things like values and that concept of the glass being half empty and half full. So thank you so much for those incredible, powerful thoughts. And we are looking to have some questions. I think we've got a few. No, we don't have any in the chat room yet. So, Paul, I suspect you probably have one or two questions for us to stimulate some interaction and some conversation.
So I think that I think that the question for people is, how do you think about leadership as a more collective act in your work? And really that's, there's obviously, I'm a CEO, I get the difference between executive leadership and the importance and the role of executive leadership, but leadership's a broader concept than whether one's leading an organization or not. And so I guess the real question for me is around how are people really looking at leadership as a collective action and creating space for others. We have a question here that says, how do you get buy-in from team members who are not into introspection but are really into diving into strategies nor building trust relationships? And it's hard. And I think, we had a staff person who used to make us do a lot of community building stuff, and he used to remind us that this isn't something that's like an extra for our work or something that's kind of outside our work. It is our work. And I think the thing we have to remember is that people are often cynical about doing these processes. I think they're most cynical when they're facilitated poorly. And and it also matters where the trust is. And I guess there's two things I've learned in that respect. One is kind of the Jim Collins idea that first you have to make sure you have the right people on your bus, and I've learned the hard way that sometimes the people who are most cynical, actually when they're no longer there, open up everybody else in ways that are unexpected. And so I think sometimes we have to assess kind of, do we have the right team? And then we have to figure out what are the activities and how do we make sure they're facilitated and we create an environment where that trust can be built. And again, I think if we use values as a construct and have people really get into working through kind of, again, what their B's are, what their values are, and what they want to be held accountable to, and get open about where they struggle and where they succeed, then I think you start to build a platform for that. But it is hard to move people through that. I see another question here. Well, all of a sudden, like all of you typed at once, it looks like. What advice do you have for young people who might still be testing their community waters for opportunity to contribute? And I think for young people, one is that I think if the thing that I've learned over time is just with young people is just step up and do more than you think you can do, and take risks. And I think that the other thing I would say is this for young people, and this is the advice I give all of our allies, is that the biggest struggle I've seen with young people is the desire to prove they can do something by themselves rather than asking for help. And what I think sometimes mistake proving themselves as a leader as being about proving that they can come up with answers themselves. And really what you prove as a leader is that you're able to draw answers from others. And I think that it's important, that if I've got an employee who makes a mistake, if they own that mistake and ask for help, they're putting the responsibility on me to work with them through that. If they're defensive about it or they argue it, they create a set of very poor options for a supervisor. So I think the important thing for young leaders is take risks. When you make mistakes or fail, own it. Ask for help. And do more than you think you can do. Always push out from what you think you can do, because you'll be surprised. Whatever, if you're dreaming big, dream 10% or 20% bigger than you're dreaming, and shoot for that, because you'll get higher. So I really think with young people, you got to step out there. You've got to try, but remember that it's about asking for help. It's not about doing things yourself. Leadership. If we're trying to achieve a mission, the mission's never about us. It's about it's about the mission, which means our job as leaders to mobilize all the resources and people we can and enlist all the leadership we can to achieve that mission. And so don't make it about you, make it about the mission. Let's see. How do you work with partners effectively when you have to meet your own objectives? We have quotas to meet in food banks, schools, etc. Can you do only mobilization with being involved in your partner's community development activities? It is difficult to take and not give also. So the thing about collective impact that's interesting, that's really been a shift from traditional collaborations, is that collective impact, when it works, for example, is no longer about like the collaboration is something you do in addition to the work. It becomes the work. The only work your agency does at that point is the collaboration. And so I think that the challenge with a lot of collaborative efforts is it becomes something you do on the side, and it will always be something on the side then. And so I think to engage partners, we have to think differently. And again, I think the emerging field of collective impact is one that's kind of proving a new model in that space. Here's one that says, large organizations like healthcare need to use the potential in frontline staff to solve complex problems. How do we get organizations and government to look at change in a truly collaborative way? And again, I would say that I think, the importance, it works best. Catherine Fulton from the Monitor Institute, which is a great nonprofit and philanthropic consulting group, has this great quote where she says, top-down doesn't work and bottom-up doesn't add up. And I think that in change, we often have to work at both levels. And so I think that sometimes when we defer and decide to just let everything grow organically, it never grows fast enough or is scalable. And when we drive change down, it often fails. And so I think we have to find ways to mitigate that, and we have to have ways that as this person's saying, that you're bringing frontline ideas up, you're championing them, and you're using the influence of executive leadership to move those ideas while supporting leadership internally. I think it's finding the way to mitigate that difference between bottom-up and top-down and calibrate that, in fact. That to me is how change really happens. Let's see.
Yeah, Paul, I think we maybe have time for one more question. Is there another question that's up there, or did we answer all of the questions, I think, actually? One further up. Oh, is there one further up? By Karen. Okay, I believe...
How do we go about changing the systems we work in to allow us workers, leaders, to work from a collaborative philosophy? In other words, an organization may hold those values, but the system that funds you, healthcare, works from the empty philosophy. Indeed. I think that's the challenge I find is often we find ourselves in a gap between the way the systems are set up and the way we know the work can be done best. And again, I think we have to find ways that we can both kind of meet the demands of the system, but also push the system to change. And I don't think those are opposite things. I think you can be doing both at the same time. But I think that indeed is a huge challenge. Is, funding is siloed. And one of the big lessons, for example, in the collective impact field has been that the funders, that the first job is unsiloing the funders even before you unsilo the organizations and work, because the funding is so siloed. And, people's lives don't happen. People don't have a health problem one day, an education problem the next day, and an economic problem the next. People's problems are interrelated and complex. And I think that often our solutions are siloed because of funding sources in ways that make it difficult for people. Just one closing comment, which I was speaking in Chicago, and this foundation sponsored a bunch of neighborhood activists to come, and there were a panel with 3 other leaders talking about the work of their organizations. And this woman stood up in the audience, and she said, could you all move in together, because you all sound great, and I don't know where to find you all, and we can't find all the stuff that's out there. And if you're all in one place, we could go and get everything we need in one place. And I think so often we forget kind of the complexity that we create for people. And I think that we have to start thinking from the user perspective. So thank you, everybody. And if people have additional questions, tweet them to me at PaulSchmitz1. I'd be happy to answer you on Twitter, and also just great to connect with all of you. And you can check out more at everyoneleads.org as well. Thank you.
And thank you so much again, Paul. And I do hope that all of the participants online had an opportunity to, I think, be challenged in our thinking and have a broader perspective on leadership and what it is and how to encourage it, and both within ourselves and also within those that we work with. And so I want to thank you all for joining us today, and thank you again, Paul. And just as a couple of parting comments, I want to remind you that we have an opportunity to celebrate your community leader by nominating them for the 3M Health Leadership Award before Sunday, July the 6th. And there's a link that can be found on the bottom left-hand corner of your screen for information about the award and about Health Nexus. And also, just once the meeting ends, you will be directed to respond to a brief survey. Your feedback and input is really important to us as we develop additional events and look to engage with you in other activities. So please do take a minute to give us your feedback. So thank you so much, and I just hope that